Hello, my name is Jovan Agee. I'm the Political and Legislative Director of your union, coming to you from Sacramento, California. This department oversees our political, legislative, and budgetary affairs. This year, the governor introduced his budget on January 10th, which included $500 million worth of cuts for the IHSS program. What we've done over the past several months is work with his office to come up with alternatives that better align with our values. Coming to you next is Kristina Hamilton, who is our budget policy analyst, who will walk you through in greater details what those alternatives are. I hope that you enjoy this presentation.
Hi everyone, this is Kristina Hamilton, and today we're going to be talking about the new state budget and what it means for the IHSS program. Before I begin, let me say that this is a quick version of the budget presentations that our department conducted in the field offices over the last couple of weeks. Those were very detailed presentations, and today we're just going to give you what we think is the most important slides for you to take home today. And so we'll start with a quick summary of the budget process. This is how the timeline is supposed to work every year. In early January, the governor is mandated to propose a budget to the legislature for their consideration. In the weeks and months that follow, the legislature will hold subcommittee hearings to go over the various components of the budget. And for those of you who've traveled to Sacramento to participate in these budget hearings, you know basically what that looks like and how complicated sometimes these issues can get. So this is a time that takes quite a few weeks to filter out. Following the income tax deadline on April 15th, the governor will release what's called the May revision, which basically is an update to his January budget that takes into account any tax revenue that was or was not collected in the prior months, and perhaps proposes some changes to what he originally proposed in January. After the May revision, the legislature will continue to hold hearings on the budget proposals, and they are mandated by law to pass a budget by June 15th. The governor is then mandated to sign a budget by June 30th, and that budget is supposed to take effect on July 1st. That's the beginning of a new fiscal year. The state's fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. And so we recently began a new fiscal year just a few weeks ago. So what we're going to talk about now is this past January, what happened, and where we are now. The governor released his budget in early January, facing an estimated budget deficit of $27.6 billion, which was an enormous amount that needed to be reconciled. The governor proposed what he called a balanced approach to filling the deficit, and that was $12.5 billion in program cuts and $12 billion in new revenue, and setting aside $1 billion as a reserve. What that meant for the IHSS program were cuts that totaled about $500 million. This was consisting of various different types of cuts. One of them was making permanent the 3.6% across the board cut that recently was enacted in February. It added an additional 8.4% across the board cut in hours for all recipients. He proposed eliminating domestic and related services for certain recipients, eliminating IHSS services for recipients who do not have a certification from their physician that they need IHSS in order to remain safely in their homes, and he proposed eliminating state funding for the advisory committees. Going back to the big picture of the budget, the governor wanted the legislature to get the budget approved by March 1st. This is an unusually early timeline for passing a budget, but the reason behind it was having time to set up a June special election to allow the people to vote on certain tax extensions that basically were the revenue part of his budget proposal. He needed 2/3 of vote of the legislature to get this proposal on the special election in June, and so his goal starting off was to get the 2/3 vote that he would need to do that. Now, after the hearing process in Sacramento, by mid-March, the legislature did vote to approve about $10 billion in cuts to state programs and services. They rejected many of the governor's proposals for IHSS, but they did adopt alternative proposals that achieved the targeted savings of $486.2 million. Those cuts and savings were enacted through Senate Bill 72, which is the Human Services Trailer Bill. It was signed on March 24th into law. Here is what Senate Bill 72 contains. These are the cuts and savings to IHSS that are in fact law and have recently been enacted on July 1st. There is now a medical certification requirement for all IHSS recipients. You will be hearing more about this requirement at the time of your next reassessment. This is anticipated to save about $68 million in savings. SB 72 also contained the mandate that the state participate in the federal Community First Choice option, which is a incentive program that's part of federal health care reform that basically promotes home care services over institutional services in all of the states. And so by participating in this program, California would reap in about $128 million in additional federal funds. SB 72 also mandated the elimination of the county requirement to have an IHSS advisory committee. It also eliminated most of the state funding for the committees. Instead, the committees will function on the public authority level, and each public authority is going to get a minimal amount of money per year to run those committees. SB 72 also contained a mandate that the state engage in the medication dispensing pilot project, which is a pilot project to reduce hospitalization of Medicaid recipients. It's a fairly complicated project that I'm not going to go into right now, but we have more information for those who are curious about it and who might want to participate. But basically the idea is to install medication dispensing machines into Medicaid recipient homes. This would be a targeted pilot group of individuals who on a voluntary basis could participate, and by having these medication dispensing machines, it would the idea would be is it would reduce hospitalization of folks who are at risk of not taking their medication as prescribed or on schedule. And it is expected to achieve about $140 million in savings through reduced hospitalization and other emergency room care from people not taking their medications as prescribed. Part of this proposal, however, is a trigger that if the savings are not achieved in part by July of next year, there will be an across-the-board cut in service hours to make up for the balance of the savings that did not reach the 140 million target. There is an appeal process as well. So if you would like more information about this pilot, please contact us. Now, following the enactment of SB 72 in May, we saw the proposal of the May revision. Following the May revision, it became clear that the governor was not going to be able to get the support necessary to have 2/3 vote of the legislature to get his tax revenue proposals on the ballot. And so at that point we saw an effort by legislative Democrats to begin constructing a budget that they could pass with a simple majority, which is what they did. They put a budget together which they passed on June 15th in order to meet the deadline. However, the governor vetoed this budget the next day, and this hasn't happened in any recent history, and so it was a very notable event, which basically meant that the legislative Democrats who have the majority in both the Senate and the Assembly had to start from the beginning to work with the governor to pass a budget that he would in fact sign. And that's what they did. At the end of June, we saw them putting a budget together, which was signed by the governor on June 30th. And so, going back to the original problem of the deficit, we have to ask ourselves, how was he able to fill the budget gap without the necessary votes to approve revenue extensions? Without that revenue, about $12.7 billion still needed to be addressed in terms of a deficit. We did see at the same time that tax receipts have been much higher than expected. So the state was collecting more in revenue this year and is anticipated for the next fiscal year. So what happened was the budget gap was filled through a combination of spending cuts totaling about $15 billion and increased revenue. And this is not in the form of the revenue proposals that the governor originally wanted, rather increased money that was being collected from existing taxes that was above and beyond what was expected. And then, of course, there are other components, including deferred payments to education, all of which totaled about $27.2 billion, which filled the deficit that was faced by the state back in January. What that means for health and human services programs, the cuts to Health and Human Services was about $5 billion. We definitely took a brunt of the cuts to state programs. We saw a $2 billion cut to the Medi-Cal program. You'll see that the IHSS program reductions and savings totaled about $413 million. In the end, we took about 1/3 of all the overall cuts in programs and services was in health and human services programs. Another part of the final budget was these new triggers, and this is something you'll be hearing about a lot in the radio and in newspapers. Basically, the Department of Finance will make a decision in mid-December whether or not the state is going to continue to get that additional tax money that it's been seeing over the last year. And so, you know, if the trend continues as is, this trigger is not going to be a problem for us. However, if they determine that the state is not going to be seeing that additional tax money that it expects to see, it will make a determination that will trigger additional cuts to state programs to take effect in January. These triggers are done in tiers. The tier 1 is basically if general fund revenue for the fiscal year is about $1 billion less than what is expected, we will see over $600 million in new cuts to state programs. Of this amount, about $100 million would come from the IHSS program through a across-the-board reduction of 20% to all recipient service hours. And there is an appeal process if this happens. Now, the second tier of trigger is if general fund revenue is about $2 billion less than expected. In that case, we will see an additional $1.9 billion in spending cuts, mostly to K-12 education. There wouldn't be any further cuts to IHSS in this scenario. And so what we need to understand is that we're not out of the woods. Basically, in December, we could be facing an additional series of across-the-board cuts up to about $100 million. And so what we need to remember is that the revenue piece, the original proposal that was put forth in January, was never achieved. And so UDW is recognizing that achieving new revenue is the most important thing that we can be doing to protect the IHSS program, because, you know, without it, every year we're going to be going through the same song and dance of cuts to our program. And so what we're going to talk about next is what that means from here on in and how we hope to accomplish this new revenue in the coming year.
In closing, over the next 16 months, we're going to be working with allies to ensure that we get the necessary revenues on the ballot so that we can begin to eliminate some of these annual budget fights that we are engaged in. Your political participation is key to ensure that we're successful at the ballot box. We need for you to contact your local office, ensure you're registered to vote, and that you know your union's position. We hope that this presentation has been valuable to you, and if you have any additional questions, do not hesitate to call your union.